right, welcome back to the Dusty Archives podcast. I'm Ben Alcher, joined by our resident historian Katrina Bell, as we get ready to continue on with our discussion about the Progressive Era. If you remember, we last left off talking about two prominent luminaries of this time period as it related to mass media, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph, or as you affectionately called him, Joey Pulitzer,
Joey.
um, and how their upbringing affected their introduction into the world of mass media, how they came to own their respective newspaper empires, and their changes and sort of the long lasting changes, really, that they had on journalism in general. And now, as we move on to our next episode, we're going to sort of shift to the other end of the journalism spectrum and get away from some of the sensationalism and some of the I guess, TMZification of news at the time and get into the nitty gritty, real life, hardcore expose type journalism known at the time as muckraking.
Yes, and I do have a couple of correction quickies, or quickie corrections, we'll call them. First is that it was Outcult that had created the Yellow Kid, and that's where yellow journalism got its name, it was from the Hogan's
Right.
Alley cartoons. That was created by Outcult. I didn't mix them up. And the second is I just had a little bonus thought a couple days ago that I texted you about. Um, Hearst actually had I feel like mouthpiece is too strong of a word, but it's also in my brain the correct word. On both coasts, and because he had the Examiner in San Francisco on the Pacific coast, and then at this time he also had the New York Journal, and it just kind of created that perfect storm for getting the word about Cuba literally across the country.
Right.
And then people that were meeting in the middle were just like, "Oh, did you hear about Cuba?" And they're like, "Yeah, man, this is crazy."
Well, and this is also that era where we start to see, the monopolization, not just of newspapers, but of a lot of businesses in general,
Oh yeah.
coming out of the Industrial Revolution. But this is where you start to get sort of titans of journalism, and Hearst and Pulitzer were certainly two of those first, sort of, in this era. But one thing that they didn't control was the entire narrative. While they did certainly have heavy control over the newspaper circulation of the time, especially in New York City, and as you mentioned, in other parts around the country, there were certainly other avenues where people were getting information, and it wasn't all about sort of the big news of the world. We had areas, and where these muckrakers went was about more of the common day-to-day life of the general public, and sort of pulling back the curtain on how not so rosy life was for a lot of people during this time.
Yeah, no, it was not a fun time to be living in. I don't envy anybody that was living in these conditions or this time. The first book that I'm trying to find a date on, can't remember if it was 1901. So we're right in that sweet spot of did the Progressive Era start in 1900 or 1890s? Because Jacob Riis emigrated in the 1890s with his camera and produced this book called How the Other Half Lives. I'm sure everybody has heard that saying at least once or twice.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty sure this book is where it gets where we can credit the
Absolutely.
origin from. And then I have the arguably most notable muckraking piece, which is the reason that we have clean food and fresh food. Because if you read this book, you will swear off of meat for at least a couple months, which at least I did. I don't know if that's coming up. It's not really coming
Yeah.
up so well on my end.
Well, the jungle. You can see that one. Upton Sinclair there at the
Yes.
bottom. Obviously,
There.
probably the first name that jumps to mind when you think of muckraking. And
Yes.
as we, you know, went
You kind
over
of
in a
brought him up
previous.
here and there a couple times. Sorry to
Yeah.
jump in.
No, that's fine. Just saying, as we covered in a previous episode, the term muckraking itself didn't even really get cemented until Teddy Roosevelt already was into his second term as president.
Yeah. And we have this book to thank for it. I mean, obviously, this was still a trend, like expose journalism. Again, nothing new. Same thing with sensational journalism. Nothing new. It's just they finally got names at this time period because there was such this insurgence,
Hmm.
I guess, is an influx. Because we had Ida Tarbell. I'm going to argue that Nellie Bly was a muckraker, and she was working for Pulitzer at the New York World in 1887, which is why I argue 1890s.
Hmm.
She did 10 Days in a Madhouse on Blackwell Island in New York City. I just listened to a podcast called My Favorite Murder, which covered her story. And I saw that and I just about jumped out of my seat. I was so excited. I was like, that's my girl, Elizabeth Cochran, Nellie Bly. Uh, Ida Tarbell. What? I get her and Ida B. Wells mixed up? But they were both very famous muckrakers. And oh, Ida Tarbell. Okay, what did she?
So this is really, something we're talking about in terms of muckraking. Again, even before the term is necessarily coined, the practice exists. This is this sort of
Right,
documentary style expose type journalism, sort of revealing some of the horrors of what life is like in this era. And again, it's really sort of, again, when we use the term progressive era, this is part of what leads to the progressiveness of this
exactly.
era, because we can point to a lot of these particular situations, a lot of these things that were revealed during this time,
Right,
directly leading to policy changes later on in the era and moving forward pre Great Depression.
exactly. And Ida Tarbell wrote Expose the Standard Oil Company. I knew one of them did oil and the other one did like lynching in the South. The most popular example of Ida B. Wells Barnett, or Ida B. Wells, it's published under both names,
Hmm.
is The Red Record, tabulated statistics on lynching in the South. And she, as a Black woman herself, she was just like, I'm getting sick of this. We're going to get to the nitty gritty and we're going to expose everything. Then you had Jacob Riis, who was an immigrant himself from Denmark. And he came along with just the clothes on his back and a camera. And he was forced to sleep in a tenement house, or as we know, a slum. And um, Jacob Riis just took his camera and he was going through New York City and he was photographing all of these immigrants sleeping like in absolutely horrible conditions in the 1890s. And so that's why we have better housing rights for immigrants. So a lot of these things just kind of, like I mentioned before, they just keep weaving in, they just keep feeding off of each other.
Right, exactly. And that was sort of the whole overarching point again, where we talked about, at the beginning of this time in the progressive era, it was sort of how the journalistic practices of the times, whether it be yellow journalism or whether it be muckraking, how they had an overall impact on the massive immigrant population that was coming into America during this time and the lasting effects that they would have in the years and decades to come.
Yeah,
So,
and sorry, continue.
no, go.
um, I admit that I had this mind frame before I started like this big research project, but I was like, well, if muckraking had all these positive impacts on the European immigrant population, then obviously yellow journalism, which is the antithesis of muckraking, clearly had to have a terrible impact. And it kind of did, but I didn't know that it had like good intentions behind it.
Right.
So that really kind of messed me up a little bit because I was just like, were they altruistic or not? Were they really trying to do this for the betterment or like what's going on?
Well, ultimately, I think as we sort of came to the conclusion in our last episode, it was as much about the bottom line and raking in as many sales and circulations as anything, as it was about affecting how people lived.
Unfortunately, yeah. It was like I said, good intentions, questionable execution.
But again, as newspapers at this time, incredibly popular, shifting in towards yellow journalism and sensationalism. So again, as you say, sort of opposite end of the spectrum, antithesis of muckraking. Obviously, for these journalists to reach the public, to reach their wide audience, they had to have some different avenues. So some newspapers still were able to utilize their talents to get through expose journalism, but they had to have different ways to go about it. You just showed a couple of examples there. Books were certainly one way, but magazines, which were also incredibly
Yes.
popular at this time, was another avenue for some of these muckraking style journalists to get the word out to people about things that were going on in the country.
Yes. And let's see, where did that article go? There it is. So this is an article. It's not by research starters. That's okay, there is no author listed. So we're gonna go with Salem Press Encyclopedia. This is like one of those peer-reviewed sources that when you go into like your school's library and you just type in muckraking, it'll give you like an idea starter, like a research starter,
There
and
you
that
go.
just gives like a basic rundown of it. But as we've seen, it's pretty difficult to peg a basic rundown of yellow journalism and muckraking. But the first sentence of the muckraking one is the turn of the 20th century brought about the rise of so-called quality or slick magazines, including Collier's Weekly, Cosmopolitan, McCall's Magazine, McClure's Magazine, Munsey's Magazine, Saturday Evening Post, and others. Combining popular appeal with serious purpose, these magazines printed news and commentary side by side with fiction. So I think this is also where the conflation of or the confusion of muckraking and yellow journalism gets brought about is because these magazines were also like, hey, did you read this new fiction piece? It's great. But then on the other hand, you have Upton Sinclair saying, hey, don't eat that pork. That's not,
Right.
they used everything but the squeal. So just a heads up. And it was because of this confusion that the public just started to go into like, not a mass frenzy, but they didn't know what to believe.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know who they could trust. They didn't know, like, was the Maine actually blown up by Spain? Or was it, a mystery explosion? Because New York Times is saying cause of explosion still unknown.
Right.
So they were still getting like these conflicting reports. And then, you have the muckrakers coming about with all of their reports, and there was just mass confusion and hysteria. And so Teddy Roosevelt, again, Princess Diana, who Teddy's our princess. Teddy was laying a cornerstone at, where was it? Oh, the House of Representatives. Sorry, my nose just started running.
And this is setting up his man with a muckrake speech.
It's commonly known as the Man with the Muck-Rake speech. However, the actual name of it is such a mouthful. I
It's easier
can't
to call it the man with the muckrake speech.
exactly. It's easier just to be like, oh yeah, the Man with the Muck-Rake speech. Thank you, Momo.
Well, this is where the term gets coined, and this is where Teddy Roosevelt again, really obviously seems to recognize clearly the importance of these journalists in this time and how they will have an effect on policy.
I gotta get my goggles real quick. Thing with depth perception and not having any.
There we go. See, now we're down to serious business.
Yes, when Katrina gets her glasses on. Okay, so he starts off the speech with like, we've grown a lot as this nation has progressed in the past 130 years or so, give or take. Um, he's just starting off with a basic history
Mm-hmm.
of the United States, but he's still talking about how human nature stays the same. Um, The material problems that face us today are not such as they were in Washington's time, but the underlying facts of human nature are the same now as they were then. Under altered external form, we war with the same tendencies toward evil that were evident in Washington's time, and are helped by the same tendencies for good. It is about some of these that I wish to say a word today. So he was just like, buckle up. Like, and again, I can't deliver the speech as eloquently as I'm sure Teddy was able to. So please, I'm sitting at a weird angle tonight, so
Well,
my diaphragm's a little wonky.
he was ready to drop some truth on some people, which he always was willing to do.
Oh, he was also just annoyed. As I mentioned earlier in that letter to, was it William Allen White or Walter Allen White? He called
Mhm.
Sinclair a crackpot. So, like, he was just saying that this guy's unhinged, don't know what he's talking about, because the jungle got so much attention because they were genuine real life horrors
Mhm.
that he was describing. I had to put it down like every 10 pages and like take a breath and go, that's not the pork that's in my fridge. That's not the pork that's in my freezer. Like, that's not the food I ate last night. Like, we're good. Uh, and so this is just all causing such an uproar, excuse me, that Teddy finally had enough. April 14th, 1906, he delivers a speech. And this is where the man with the muck rake is born, right here, this little quote. In Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, you may recall the description of the man with the muck rake, the man who could look no way but downward, with the muck rake in his hand, who was offered a celestial crown for his muck rake, but who would neither look up nor regard the crown he was offered, but continued to rake himself the filth of the floor. In Pilgrim's Progress, the man with the muck rake is set forth as the example of him whose vision is fixed on carnal instead of spiritual things. Yet he also typifies the man who in this life consistently refuses to see aught that is lofty and fixes his eyes with solemn intentness only on that which is vile and debasing. It's pretty much saying, like, that's disgusting what you are writing about. You are raking it up. And from my interpretation and being raised in rural New Hampshire, a muck rake is used for cleaning out the muck of the stalls with horses and cows. And I did grow up kind of on a dairy farm as well.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, to me, it's
Muck is
more.
species. We're just
It,
gonna
it,
get that out of the way.
right.
It's
No,
species.
yeah, that's clear enough. I guess to me, it really seems like it's more the comparison of he is saying that, you know, these people are focused on the muck that is in
Yes.
front of them, and they
Instead
are
of
not
breaking it.
interested in, lofty crowns, or they're not interested in, you know, riches and being famous for whatever they're producing. They are only interested in what is
Yes.
dirty, what is filthy, and
Yes.
putting that, putting that to their work.
Right. He goes on to continue saying, now it is very necessary that we should not flinch from seeing what is vile and debasing. There is filth on the floor and it must be scraped up with a muck rake. And there are times and places where the service is the most needed of all the services that can be performed. So, it's a necessary evil, is pretty much what he's saying in this speech. Like, muckraking, good, yellow journalism, get some truth behind it, then we'll talk.
Yeah. I mean, recognizing certainly the importance of, the person or the act of, you know, cleaning cleaning that filth, because someone's got to do it, right? And so, um, certainly we had a variety of people who were doing all sorts of different muckraking type responsibilities. And
Oh, yeah.
again, I think you circle back to Upton Sinclair is usually the first name that kind of pops into everyone's head when you talk about muckraking,
Exactly.
largely due to the jungle, as you said. But um, although that may have been maybe his most famous uh, muckraking adventure, he certainly was very willing
Arguably
to
his
throw
most well
himself in
known.
others. Yeah.
Yeah. This entire speech, I pretty much just like highlighted everything because Teddy has a way with words, and I'm just like, it's all important. I don't know.
Right.
But my one of my favorite quotes from this entire speech that I have like memorized: "The liars know it better than the thief, and if his mendacity takes the form of slander, he may be worse than most thieves. It puts a premium upon knavery untruthfully to attack an honest man, or even with hysterical exaggeration to assail a bad man with untruth." So he's just like, he's pretty much just telling Hearst and Joey to just knock it off, please. Like, you guys are terrible right now. Just please stop. We don't need any more of this. This with the expose journalism that Upton Sinclair was writing about. It's just not meshing. It's just not a
Right.
good fit. Like, we need to figure this out. And so he just took advantage of this of delivering this speech at the cornerstone laying and was just like, we're just gonna knock this out real quick, get it over with. Um, I did have the dates of the acts. Well, I guess it's not necessary right now. Yeah, it was shortly after the speech that the Meat Inspection Act was passed, which then led to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And then the Pure Food and Drug Act, I'm assuming you can tell, is the
Yes.
basis for the Food and Drug Administration. So it
Right.
really had this, we still see the effects of muckraking today with,
Exactly. And I mean, sort of spiraling off of that is, you have all sorts of, new standards of food production that come into play. Um, Pretty much from uh, how the animals are raised or how the animals are kept, all the way up until, the very last stage of packaging and storage and containment in stores and in transit.
and even now, the food packing industry is still getting a lot of um, criticisms from like PETA and think other organizations for being inhumane and how they keep the livestock. And then you even see like cage-free chickens, cage-free eggs. Like, it's still a big thing because people want to know with what they're putting into their body,
Right.
where it's coming from.
Hmm.
Is it safe?
And it is wild to think that, somewhat in a sense, prior to this book coming out and prior to Upton Sinclair going undercover, there were no standards. It was sort of just
I worked in
whatever
too
it
many
whatever it took.
restaurants. I worked in too many restaurants, and I'm an anxious mom of two.
Mhm.
Not quite a germaphobe, but after reading The Jungle, I kind of became one a little bit. It's not a fun ride.
And again, that's certainly the maybe the most prominent example that is always presented when muckraking sort of discussed in its generality. But we know beyond Upton Sinclair, and there were certainly many others. You highlighted Jacob Riis as another one, maybe at the early advent of sort of this era of expose journalism.
Yeah, it was. He immigrated in the 1870s or 1880s. I'm not 100% sure on.
Mhm.
I didn't case study Riis as much as I did Sinclair,
Right, early progressive era still.
but my bachelor's thesis paper was about how Jacob Riis and Teddy Roosevelt were best friends. Meanwhile, Teddy Roosevelt and Upton Sinclair were just butting heads constantly. But yet it feels like Sinclair achieved more
Hmm.
by being so aggressive. And then Riis was just like, hey, Teddy, if you could just make this like a quick thing, real quick, just sign this piece of paper. And he's like, sure, sounds great. Um, I just lost my train of thought. I am so sorry.
Well, you were with Riis
Yes.
in terms of the effects that his muckraking and sort of his exposés had on Teddy Roosevelt and the policy changes that would come about as a result of his work.
Yeah. And so Riis, you know, I don't want to say the only accomplishment because it's still a large accomplishment that he
Right.
achieved was securing tenement housing or housing rights for immigrants, which is another thing that we'll see pop up with the Triangle Fire. And like I said, it just all circles back and it all starts to meld together and just kind of stack one on top of the other and feed into each other.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, when we talk about sort of, again, that sort of collaboration,
yes.
the Meat Inspection Act and all of that would affect immigrants not only as it related to, the food that they were consuming, but also many of the jobs that they worked in, especially in the Midwest where food production was prevalent. And obviously the jungle we know is set in Chicago. So,
Yes.
that obviously had an impact in two areas of their lives, the food that they ate and then where they worked.
And thank you for bringing that up because it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Upton Sinclair. He wrote an article for Cosmopolitan magazine in 1906. I can't remember the exact date of the article, but he said, quote, "I aimed at the public's heart and by accident I hit it in the stomach." Because his entire goal of writing The Jungle was just to be like, hey guys, we have this large Eastern European immigrant population density,
Hmm.
and they're working in the meatpacking industry. And I've heard not so great things. I'm just going to go undercover for like a week and then write about this and then see what we
Right.
can do to help these immigrants. And then we got pure food out of it, which, hey, I'm thankful
Right.
for it. Thank you, Upton.
Everybody
Thank
is.
you, Teddy. Thank you, everybody. But it wasn't his goal. He achieved a goal,
Hmm.
which was to make positive change and a positive impact by writing this disgusting book. Like it's a good book, it's just
Right.
nasty. Uh, but like he said, I aimed at the public's heart, but missed and hit in this by accident, hit it in the stomach. There we go.
Well, that was what really resonated with people more so than just, maybe the plight of the Eastern European immigrant. It was more of, well, what the heck's going on with my food?
I think it's more of a foreign policy oriented thing as well because you had Hearst who owned the Examiner and the New York Journal, which I think at this point was the American, or renamed to the New York American. And and as we've mentioned before, Hearst was very xenophobic, and
Hmm.
if it's not white, then I don't want it. Or if it's not,
Right.
Anglo-centric, we don't want it. So I think that also had something to do with even in Chicago, where all these Eastern Europe, Lithuanians specifically, where all these immigrants were located, we were just like, we as Americans, not you and I, but back then we were just like, they're coming in. It's the same argument that you've heard from tried and true red-blooded Americans. They're coming in, they're taking our jobs, they're doing this, they're doing
Right.
X. They're not. And that's what Upton was trying to prove is just like, we just need to treat them equally as
Hmm.
we want to be, like, we want to give them the same working conditions that we get, was the goal.
Well, it certainly resonated then and still obviously resonates in a lot of different ways today. Um, Beyond Upton Sinclair, beyond Jacob Riis, certainly those are two prominent names, but so many more, and really a lot that kind of get lost just because they may not have had the same level of impact at the time, and but their work and the results of their work certainly lives on.
Yeah, and another big name is Lincoln Steffens. I believe he focused on political corruption. American Winston Churchill. There wasn't, and he lived. So I live in Claremont, New Hampshire, and the American Winston Churchill also did political corruption, and he lived in Cornish, New Hampshire, which is about 20 minutes, 10, 15 minutes north of me. Take 12A, because I remember seeing this historical
These
marker that just
highways
said
will.
Winston Churchill, and I was like, what? So if anybody wants to know, it is privately owned now by actual people that live there, so please don't bother them. But it's Harlechanden Drive is where the historical marker is. And it just goes over his accomplishments. And I think he passed away in 1917.
Kind of interesting to give someone the nickname of the American Churchill before the British Churchill really kind of comes into play in history.
Well, when Sir Winston Churchill, Prime Minister, was writing books, he wrote to the American Winston Churchill. And that's why you'll see either Winston Churchill, that's American, and then Winston S. Churchill for Spencer.
Okay.
So a little extra fun fact for you there. I mentioned Nellie Bly. I'm gonna go ahead and lump her into the muckraking category just because of her work at Blackwell Island with 10 Days in a Madhouse. If you want to know more about that, definitely look up My Favorite Murder, episode 401. Um,
And that having to do with mental health institutions at the time.
yes, unfortunately at the time they were called madhouses or lunatic
Right.
asylums. Again, it's not Katrina and Ben speaking, it's 1880s speaking.
No, and again, this is obviously the context of the time, which is always something important to take into account. And
Exactly.
again, those familiar with the New England area, there's obviously a lot of those facilities that still exist in some form or fashion, at least in structure. I know in Massachusetts, I think somewhere on the North Shore, there's a large institution that used to exist that still is mostly together, but is certainly not used for that purpose in any way, not used for anything. I think, in fact, it sort of just exists as a sort of landmark to time.
Let's go explore an abandoned building. I'm down.
Uh, Very likely
Uh,
a haunted abandoned building, which I have no interest in. Thank you.
you are selling me even more on it.
Yeah, right.
um, yeah, there was also Ida Tarbell. She exposed the oil company, and Lincoln, not Lincoln, Upton Sinclair had also written an expose on the oil industry. He was just kind of dipping his toes into everything, really.
Well, that's really, taking a big shot if you're going after the
Yeah.
Rockefellers and Standard Oil,
I mean,
which.
he already went big with the jungle, so like, what the hell? What's oil? You
Well, but
know?
that's different. So, but again, the jungle, the meatpacking industry, I'm sure at the time was probably, similarly somewhat monopolized. But you talk about Standard Oil and the Rockefellers, not just one of the richest, if not the richest family or company in America at the time, also, very politically connected. So, that is aiming high in terms of, muckraking status. And again, why this progressive era gets its name, we know that on the heels of a lot of these investigative, pieces and exposure of corruption, we would get policy that would end up breaking up a lot of these monopolies.
Yeah, and there's another reason that Teddy is called the Trust Buster. Like that was literally the name of the game. When he was speaking softly and carrying a big stick, he was just like, I don't like this idea. I don't like that. I don't like how you're monopolizing this industry. Like people need to eat, people need to be warm, people need a place to sleep. Like like I said, Diana who? Like we stand Teddy in this house. We're gonna get with the Gen Z slang. I think I did pretty good there.
But that is, I mean, that's certainly obviously, again, Nellie Bly, who, for those not familiar,
And
her work probably, you know, had a significant impact on that sort of ability of the president to break up the monopoly.
and Ida B. Wells Barnett, she was also iconic. She was from Mississippi, I believe, and that is where she did gathered all of her statistics on lynching and like how many were happening per year, per week, in this one section of her town. And it's horrifying. And
Yes.
I'm gonna throw out that content warning really quickly. If you're gonna pick up a muckraking book, be prepared to just be horrified. Watch a funny movie after you're done reading these books because they are not not ideal for depressed minds.
Well, that was the goal of a lot of these, right? Was to sort of, spark outrage and spark sort of that call to action. And yeah, looking at the South in this time period, obviously, we know about
Jim
the Jim
Crow.
Crow laws
Yeah.
of the previous era, and certainly we know, civil rights and is
Oh
not
yeah.
really going to come into, major policy effect for another 50 years. So we're still dealing in a time period where, you know, African Americans are free, but certainly not
But they're not.
feeling like they're
Yeah.
dealing with a great level of freedom, and certainly um, being oppressed at many many different avenues still in America.
Yeah. And I mean, and as a white woman, I can't speak for that experience, but they were, from my research that I've done, they were on paper free. They, they were free on paper
Right.
as far as legally was concerned.
Yeah,
Um,
we know that certainly Jim Crow laws were very in vogue at this time and sort of figuring out all sorts of ways to still suppress parts of the population.
yes. I think that's all I got on muckraking, really.
Well, we've certainly hit on a lot of different names, hit on a lot of different policies, and well, we've got a little bit more still to cover with the progressive era. We've talked about it on a couple of occasions, and it is maybe one of the seminal moments of the time period, but one that often gets underplayed, and that's something you've mentioned: the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire.
Yes, it's again, it's going to be horrifying. I cry every time I watch a documentary or like read some more about it, and I'm like, oh, so if I cry during recording, you're good.
Well, we'll have the tissues on standby and we will
Yes,
power through, but we will go over this seminal moment in history that, again, in your history classes, you probably didn't go over this one. So it'll be very informative, and we will look forward to bringing it to you next time on the Dusty Archives podcast. That's Katrina. I'm Ben. We will see you next time with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire.
oh, and the shirtwaist makers strike.
And the
I mean,
strike.
it kind of ties in together, but they're two separate events that are connected, and I love it. So, yes, be good to yourselves. Take care of yourselves.